Hello, 1301. This is the lecture on how to tame a wild tongue. I switched from coffee to water. I think that was a good call. And I turned the camera like east-west instead of north-south, like I should have done in the first video. But again, it's the coronavirus 2020, like quarantine mode. How to tame a wild tongue is ultimately about language. I would say entering into the serpent is about the patriarchy and how men have dominated women. What I said before about La Llorona. This one's about language. Usually in my face-to-face classes, I think this essay is a little bit easier to understand. So I generally start with this one, face-to-face. If I followed along, she starts How to Tame a Wild Tongue with a couple stories. Little Gloria Anzaldua is at the dentist, white dentist, and she's talking, and the dentist says, "Shut up, you talk too much, I'm working on your teeth." And then the second story, she talks about being in school, 6th grade, the teacher doesn't know how to pronounce her name, so the teacher yells at her and says, "Shut up, Gloria, speak English." So that, and the teacher could have said, "Gloria, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Anzaldua. Would you help me with that?" But the teacher's mean and domineering. And sometimes in my face-to-face classes, I'll ask for stories like that about when you were in school, when your mom was in school, when your grandmother was in school, a story where the white teacher was mean. Or maybe you were like the only Hispanic student in the class and like you were made to feel alone or bad. Sometimes I talk about students from other countries. They might speak 3-4 languages, be whip smart, but they're in like an English-speaking classroom and they're kind of made to feel stupid because English isn't their first language. So this essay is a bit like that. The second page, she says, Pocho cultural traitor. You're speaking the oppressor's language by speaking English. You're ruining the Spanish language. Again, I don't speak Spanish. To me, pocho kind of means sellout. Like, you would go to your grandmother's house for Thanksgiving, maybe in Chihuahua, the land of little dogs. Maybe you're wearing like American clothes, listening to American music, and you're speaking Spanglish or Tex-Mex, which we'll get to. And your grandmother doesn't like that. Your grandmother's like, "You've sold out to America. You're Mexican. Don't be like that." So to me, pocho is cultural traitor, like she says. I'm a hillbilly. I'll go to like my aunt Nora's house for New Year's Eve or something, and I'm a professor, and a lot of my cousins work in a factory or they're in the Navy, and they think, "Ooh, you're too smart for us." And we know that's not true. But in terms of language, what pocho, maybe I should talk about Spanglish and Tex-Mex, because she seems to think in 1985 that it's cool, funky, innovative. Spanglish is American language and Mexican language coming together, creating a new language, and it's funky and cool. And then I would ask about your grandmother. If you were in Chihuahua, the land of the little dogs, speaking Spanglish, would your grandmother not like that? So, and Anzaldua thinks it's cool, like the creation of a new language. On page 87, she breaks down the 8 languages she speaks. Standard English, working class and slang English, standard Spanish, standard Mexican Spanish, North Mexican Spanish dialect, Chicano Spanish, Tex-Mex, Pachuco, called Calo. And I would ask, the same thing about like Spanglish. Is that innovative and cool if that's the way you speak? And do you change when you talk to your boss at work? Do you talk to your teacher differently than you talk to your friends? You probably do. Like after all these years, I kind of talk this way to everyone, whether I'm talking to a 5-year-old or a 70-year-old. I'm forgetting my what I wanted to say. And as you read this, like, and there's sections in Spanish, one of the questions on your sheet, is she doing that to empower Hispanic speakers, or is she doing it to mess with the system? Does she want me as the Anglo teacher to struggle with this? She makes me work harder. She makes me sweat when I'm translating Spanish sections. I don't know how to translate. And maybe that's easier for you, like if you believe. She goes on to talk about Chicano Spanish on 88. She kind of says your language is your identity. The way other people understand who you are, what you are, is through your language. There's sections where she talks about maybe being the only Hispanic speaker in a class and the impact on your self-esteem. I'm looking for a section. So if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin-skinned linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicano Spanish, Texas, Tex-Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself. I would say the best paper I've read since I've been at Odessa College was written by a student who, she only spoke English and her grandparents only spoke Spanish. And she would write about the guilt she felt in a room at Thanksgiving or Christmas or at the mall. She speaks English, her grandparents speak Spanish, and they can't really communicate. And I would say, since I've been here about 3 years, that's the best paper I've read. She talks about guilt. She talks about she thinks her grandparents are disappointed in her. But it's about language as like who she is. Anzaldua talks about in graduate school trying to slip in Chicano or Mexican texts into her lesson, and the mainstream English department didn't want to do that. In 2020, in California, there are entire English departments that are structured around Anzaldua. Not Shakespeare, not Faulkner, not Hemingway. Anzaldua is the linchpin of the whole English department. She talks a bit about culture. Sometimes in class, we'll talk about music and movies and food. I'll tell the classes, like my theater, like when I was a kid, to go to the theater, it was in Culpeper, Virginia, about 20 minutes away. Cheech and Chong made it to that theater. Selena made it to that theater. La Llorona with Linda Cardinelli made it to that theater. And I asked my students, if you're a hillbilly in Virginia, is Cheech a good role model? If he's the only one that made it to Central Virginia in 1980. And I think Rodriguez would say, no, bad role model. But Anzaldua would say, appreciate what you have. Cheech is funny. Same goes for Conan the Wrestler. But sometimes in class, we'll break into groups and talk about Hispanic music, food, other aspects of culture. So you could write something like that. She talks a bit about cultural alienation. If you're a Hispanic American in Odessa, Texas, do you feel like you don't fit in? You probably don't, because it's 2020, it's coronavirus. But since you're part Mexican, part American, do you feel somehow alienated from Mexican culture? Do you feel somehow alienated from American culture? You're not 100% either one. That might have been true in 1985 for Anzaldua. It's probably not true for you. And then the very last paragraph of How to Tame a Wild Tongue, I read it as you just survive. She talks about the quietness of the Indian through time and space, Mexican culture, Hispanic culture, Chicana culture survives. And I will ask my students, even in the time of coronavirus, Trump, whatever, slowly but surely is Hispanic culture being felt more and more in America? Like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, I'll ask my students, when are they going to be speaking Spanish in the Fargo, North Dakota post office? Or when you go to the DMV, instructions in English, instructions in Spanish. So, and another James Baldwin point, generally I don't talk a lot about politicians. I talk about people being in the room together. Making up, making love, whatever, but in the room, generation after generation after generation, you're not afraid of someone from another culture anymore. If you're in the room with them every day, at work, at school, wherever, it becomes easier and you understand more and you can negotiate both cultures. Okay, that's it for How to Tame a Wild Tongue.